in El Paso, Texas, and in Los Angeles, and the synagogue where my friends were all bar mitzvahed when I was a kid in Denver was a modernist synagogue. But it was a little too much about modernity and not enough about the great historical traditions of the shul and of worship and of the Temple on the Mount, all of which are channeled by Howard Meyer to produce an incomparable masterpiece. Another one of the things that sort of struck me as being a Dallasite for 22 years is that we have in the city now a sort of community, a small community of serious modernist architects, untrendy, very much rooted in a local tradition and traditions of modernism in Texas. And all of those people know each other, they compete to a certain extent, they trade ideas, and there is a kind of collegiality amongst them, which is rare in cities of this size. And I think that a lot of it is almost based on that same time in Dallas architecture after the Second World War, when a group of men and women who came together, who were differently trained, who came from different areas, but were in this kind of burgeoning place and trying to create something for it that, how do I say it, that fortified it and its own sense of its self-importance, but also was had a quality of being mature and thoughtful and rooted in Texas rather than being imposed upon Texas. And Howard Meyer was definitely a member of that group. And the architects like Bud Oglesby, like Frank Welch when he came, there were a group of architects who knew each other, who belonged to the same societies, who shared clients, who were interested in why they didn't get any of the museums and big office buildings downtown, and why they had to settle for second place things and all of those things which the current architects still have. But the sort of quiet collegiality of them, and also their sense of confidence and of being almost like the avant-garde, like a group of people who knew what the future was going to be and charted it in advance of others. And Howard was part of that generation in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. And there are a group of architects who are very much in that tradition working in the city today, most of whom are really supremely aware of his buildings. I mean, almost every time one of his buildings has an aging problem, or when the brise soleil of the 3525 threatened to fall off, and were they really badly constructed, and all of this. It's one of the young, bright architects working today who was brought in to make them realize that Howard Meyer actually knew exactly what he was doing, and that they aren't dangerous at all, and all of these people were full of it. And that sense of continuity is reflected in something like that. Well, I live in a neighborhood called Greenway Parks, which has got several Howard Meyer houses, including maybe the best and most famous of the houses of the late 40s and early 50s, which is the Lipsche house. And I've actually gotten to watch the Lipsche house through 3 sets of owners and see how it's been transformed and brought back from almost extinction with one owner who really didn't understand it, to an owner who understood it incredibly well, to a later one, and to the current owner who has really done an immaculate job sort of fixing it up. And what's interesting in all of this is that the more the house veers towards the way it was when it was built and opened in 1951, the more current it seems. And that's a curious thing. It's something that you wouldn't think. You wouldn't think that when every piece of built-in furniture that had been ripped out and destroyed was rebuilt and put back exactly where it was in the plans, and the floors were done in the right ways, and the kitchen was redone, but not in a way that evoked the old kitchen. You would have thought it would have looked like 1951, but oddly it doesn't. Oddly, it looks incredibly current. And the house has sheltered different kinds of families from different traditions in different parts of the country and with different numbers of children. And sort of watching it age and adapt to that, and watching other architects work with it to realize how great it was at the beginning and to bring it back to that glory is something that makes you realize how important, how enduring, how current Howard Meyer can be, even as a historical modernist. And, we're always talking about post-war modernism and the 50s modernism as if it's something like the 18th century. But in fact, it's the first modernism that makes use of air conditioning in the automobile and appliances and all the things that we use today. And of course, all of those things have changed technologically, but the house didn't need to change with them because it already was adapted to them. And that's, I think, one of the real qualities of Howard Meyer, in contradistinction to other modernist architects who built buildings that look like 1951. The major centers for sort of media attention in architecture in the last 50 years have been New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And we consider Chicago to be, in a certain way, the capital of modernist architecture in America. And it has almost a cult status as an architecture city. So when you go there are architecture tours, and people actually look at buildings that really are no better than buildings in other places, but because they're in Chicago and because they were designed by so-and-so at such and such a time, they have a kind of eminence. I happen to come from Denver, Colorado, and my first book was about it as a city designed by architects. And what I learned from being a student at Yale and coming back to my own hometown was that there was really serious architecture in my hometown. It's just that nobody in New York or in New Haven, where I was, knew anything about it. And that wasn't its fault, it was our fault. And it's, in a certain sense, our own provinciality, the fact that we who live in provincial cities read the same things that people who live in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles read, and therefore we think the same things are important. And so we don't do very much about uncovering and coming to an understanding of the people who are important to us, and promoting them, dare I use that vulgar word, in the larger world. And I know quite a bit about 20th century architecture. And I know that Howard Meyer is a major architect in American and international terms, that his best buildings can measure up to the best buildings of anyone of his generation, and that the fact that he's unknown outside of Dallas and a few people outside of Dallas is really not his fault. And that it's up to us to describe his accomplishments at their highest level and put them into the context in which they deserve to be placed.